In this video, I'll be covering several different types of anxiety disorders, including phobias, panic disorder, and social anxiety disorder. Although not technically an anxiety disorder, I'll also discuss PTSD at the end of the video. Anxiety disorders are characterized by excessive and persistent fear and anxiety. We all experience anxiety from time to time, but for someone with an anxiety disorder, this anxiety is pervasive and debilitating, and the amount of anxiety they experience is usually out of proportion with the actual threat. As a group, anxiety disorders are fairly common. The U.S. lifetime prevalence for any anxiety disorder is around 25 to 30%. Anxiety disorders are also frequently comorbid with each other. That is, people who qualify for one anxiety disorder also frequently qualify for another as well. Let's talk more now about some specific anxiety disorders. I'll start first with specific phobia. A phobia is an excessive, distressing, and persistent fear or anxiety about a specific object or situation. Specific phobias are fairly common, with a lifetime prevalence in the U.S. of around 12.5%. Some common phobias are shown here on this slide, and include things like the fear of heights, flying, spiders, enclosed spaces, blood and injections, and dogs. Here, it's important to note that phobias involve more than mere dislike or discomfort. To qualify as a phobia, the associated fear and anxiety must be excessive, debilitating, and out of proportion with the object itself. You can see the diagnostic criteria for specific phobia here on this slide. Most people don't seek out professional treatment for phobias unless the anxiety is so severe that it is significantly impairing their everyday functioning. For example, imagine a person with the fear of flying so severe that they turn down a job promotion at work because it will involve significant air travel. Or a person with the fear of drowning so intense that they refuse to buy a home near a body of water. What causes someone to develop a phobia? Most theories suggest that phobias develop through some form of learning. For example, a phobia could be acquired through classical conditioning if the person has a fearful association with a particular object, such as if they were bitten by a dog when they were young. As a personal example, my grandma has a very intense fear of snakes. She grew up on a farm in Indiana in the mid-1900s, and I remember her telling me stories of seeing her own mother battle snakes out on the farm. For my grandma, this was a highly upsetting memory, and it likely triggered her intense fear of snakes later in life. Phobias may also be acquired through vicarious learning. For example, one study found that laboratory-raised monkeys who had never encountered snakes readily acquired a fear of snakes after seeing wild-raised monkeys react fearfully to them. Recall from Module 5 on learning that just as conditioning can trigger a phobia, so too conditioning techniques can be used to treat them. Specifically, systematic desensitization, where the person is exposed to the feared object or situation in small but gradually increasing steps, is a common and effective treatment for many phobias. Another type of anxiety disorder is panic disorder. People with panic disorder experience recurrent and unexpected panic attacks. A panic attack is a sudden episode of intense fear that triggers severe physical reactions when there is no real danger or apparent cause. During a panic attack, the person may experience troubling physical symptoms, such as a racing heart, sweating, trembling, choking sensations, hot flashes or chills, dizziness, or lightheadedness. They may also experience intense fears of losing control or going crazy and fears of dying. A panic attack is certainly a terrifying experience, and because some of the symptoms overlap with the same symptoms of a heart attack, many people end up going to the emergency room the first time they have a panic attack. It's important to note here that panic attacks, in and of themselves, are not a mental health disorder. To qualify as panic disorder, the person must also experience persistent concern and worry about having additional attacks and or engage in self-defeating changes in behavior related to the attacks. For example, the person may have intense and excessive worry about having a panic attack in a public place where it would be difficult to escape. If the person begins to avoid several places or situations out of fear of having a panic attack, then the person has also developed agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is often misunderstood or misrepresented as simply a fear of people, but this is incorrect. Agoraphobia almost exclusively accompanies panic disorder and is specifically related to the fear of having a panic attack in a public place where it would be difficult to escape or get help, not necessarily a fear of those public places in and of themselves. The lifetime prevalence of panic disorder and agoraphobia in the U.S. is around 4.7%, and about a third of people who have panic disorder go on to develop agoraphobia. Rather than agoraphobia, people with a persistent and intense fear of social situations might qualify instead for a diagnosis of social anxiety disorder, formerly called social phobia. Specifically, social anxiety disorder, or SAD, involves an intense, persistent fear of being watched and judged by others. This fear can sometimes be limited to certain very specific situations, such as a fear of eating in public, but it can also be a more general fear of being judged by others in a variety of situations. The heart of this fear is the person's concern that they may act in a humiliating or embarrassing way, such as appearing foolish, showing symptoms of anxiety like blushing, or doing or saying something that might lead to rejection, like offending somebody else. Here, it's important to note what social anxiety disorder is not. We are social beings, and most of us feel at least a moderate degree of apprehension in socially evaluative situations. This is perfectly normal and not a disorder. Social anxiety is also not the same thing as shyness. Being shy is not a mental disorder. Rather, to qualify for a diagnosis of social anxiety disorder, the fear and anxiety associated with social situations must be so strong that the person avoids them entirely or endures them with great distress. And further, this avoidance must get in the way of the person's daily life or significantly limit their social, academic, or occupational functioning. For example, someone with social anxiety disorder may regularly avoid going to informal social gatherings at work, where they would otherwise have the opportunity to network and build relationships with peers that could benefit their career. What causes social phobia? As with specific phobias, social phobia can often develop through conditioning experiences. For example, a child who is bullied or frequently rejected at school may develop negative social feelings about herself that become activated later in life. Consistent with this idea, one study reported that in a sample of adults with social anxiety, 92% reported a history of severe teasing in childhood. Comparatively, only 35% of adults with panic disorder reported this same experience. On the biological side of things, social anxiety also appears to be strongly linked with behavioral inhibition. Behavioral inhibition is characterized by a consistent tendency to show fear and restraint when presented with unfamiliar people or situations. It is displayed very early on in childhood, and for this reason is thought to be an inherited trait. Lastly, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, was historically classified as an anxiety disorder. However, in the most recent edition of the DSM, it was reclassified as a trauma-related disorder. So even though it is no longer technically an anxiety disorder, I'm still going to discuss it here at the end of this video because it has some obvious overlap with anxiety-related symptoms. For a person to be diagnosed with PTSD, they must first be exposed to or witness a traumatic experience. Recall from the last module that traumatic experiences involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. This criterion makes PTSD the only disorder in the DSM with an explicitly specified cause. People with PTSD typically experience intrusive and distressive memories of the traumatic event, called flashbacks, that are sometimes so vivid the person feels like they are reliving the event all over again. They may also avoid anything that reminds them of the trauma, including conversations, people, or places. Other symptoms include feeling emotionally numb, being especially hypervigilant and easily startled, and experiencing persistent negative emotional states, such as fear, anger, irritability, guilt, and shame. It is thought that PTSD develops through some of the same classical conditioning principles that can cause phobias and social anxiety. Specifically, the traumatic event may act as an unconditioned stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response of extreme fear and anxiety. Therefore, the same techniques used to treat phobias, such as systematic desensitization and exposure therapy, can be used to treat the symptoms of PTSD as well. Of course, not everyone who experiences a traumatic event will necessarily go on to develop PTSD. Risk factors for developing PTSD include greater trauma severity, lack of immediate social support, and more subsequent life stress. People are also more likely to develop PTSD for traumatic events that involve harm by others, such as combat, than other traumas, such as natural disasters. All told, roughly 7% of adults in the US, including 9.7% of women and 3.6% of men, experience PTSD in their lifetime. In this video, I discussed 4 different anxiety disorders: specific phobia, panic disorder, agoraphobia, and social anxiety disorder. Although not technically an anxiety disorder, I also discussed PTSD at the end of the video. For the exam, you should be able to describe the symptoms, causes, and treatments for each of the disorders that we discussed, and you should also be able to identify each disorder given an example description.